The smoke hung thick as molasses in the Broken Wheel Saloon that sweltering August evening in 1887. San Antonio's heat had driven every soul with 2 bits to spare through the batwing doors, seeking refuge in whiskey and the promise of easy money. The poker tables buzzed with the familiar symphony of clinking coins, shuffling cards, and the low murmur of men testing their luck against the house and each other. At the center table sat Wade Morrison, though most folks knew him simply as the Ace. His reputation preceded him through every gambling hall from El Paso to Houston. Gold teeth caught the lamplight when he smiled, which he did often and without warmth. His black coat, cut from fine eastern wool, cost more than most men earned in 6 months. Diamond cufflinks winked at his wrists as he dealt another hand with practiced precision. 4 men flanked him at nearby tables, their hands never straying far from their guns. They called themselves his business associates, but everyone knew muscle when they saw it. The Ace had been working this particular game for 3 hours, and his coat pockets grew heavier with each passing hand. His fingers moved like a magician's, cards appearing and disappearing with supernatural grace. The other players, mostly cattle ranchers and traveling merchants, watched their stakes dwindle with growing suspicion but lacking the courage to voice their concerns. After all, challenging the Ace Morrison was a luxury most men couldn't afford. In the corner, nursing a glass of whiskey that had barely been touched, sat an old-timer who seemed utterly out of place among the evening's high rollers. His clothes marked him as common ranch stock, simple brown trousers, and a worn cotton shirt that had seen better decades. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a weathered nose, and his gray beard showed streaks of white that spoke of 60-odd years under the Texas sun. His hands, wrapped around the whiskey glass, bore the scars and calluses of hard labor. To most eyes, he appeared to be nothing more than a tired cowhand spending his meager pay on liquid comfort. But those pale blue eyes behind the spectacles moved with quiet intelligence, tracking every motion at the Ace's table with the patience of a man accustomed to long watches. He had been observing for the better part of an hour, noting the subtle tells and practiced sleights that marked Wade Morrison as a professional cheat. The old man's fingers drummed silently against his glass, counting the seconds between each suspicious deal. Before we see how this tale unfolds, I'd love to hear from folks listening in. Drop a comment and tell me what state or country you're tuning in from. These old Western stories seem to travel far and wide, and I always get a kick out of seeing where they land. The Ace's latest victim, a cattle buyer from Fort Worth, pushed back from the table with disgust written across his sunburned features. $40 poorer, he stalked toward the bar muttering curses under his breath. Wade's gold teeth gleamed as he gathered the winnings, making no effort to hide his satisfaction. His eyes swept the saloon with predatory confidence until they settled on the old-timer in the corner. Something about the man's steady observation had begun to irritate the Ace. Most folks either joined his games or minded their own business. This old buzzard just sat there, watching, like he was studying something. Wade's paranoia, finely tuned by years of walking the razor's edge between fortune and a pine box, began to whisper warnings in his ear. The Ace stood slowly, his considerable frame casting shadows across the green felt. His associates noted the movement and shifted accordingly, hands drifting toward their weapons with practiced casualness. The saloon's ambient noise seemed to dim as Wade approached the corner table, his boots striking the floorboards with deliberate weight. "You've been watching my game awful close, old-timer," Wade said, his voice carrying the artificial friendliness of a snake oil salesman. The old man looked up from his whiskey, blinking owlishly behind his spectacles. His voice, when he spoke, carried the slow drawl of a man unaccustomed to hurried conversation. "Just enjoying my drink, son. Ain't no law against sitting peacefully in a saloon, far as I know." The response only deepened Wade's irritation. The word son, spoken with such casual dismissal, rankled against his pride. Here was some broken-down saddle tramp treating him like a green kid fresh off his mama's farm. The Ace's smile took on a sharper edge, revealing more of those gold teeth. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else," Wade suggested, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a suggestion at all. "Maybe somewhere that don't have games above your station." The old-timer took a slow sip of his whiskey, seemingly unbothered by the implied threat. His pale eyes met Wade's gaze with steady calm. This here's a public establishment, I reckon. Got my money same as anyone else." From behind the bar, Martha Kellygon watched the confrontation with growing concern. At 63, she had seen enough trouble to recognize it brewing from across a crowded room. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her simple dress marked her as one of the saloon's working women, though her age had long since moved her from entertainment to serving drinks and keeping order. She had been tending bar and waiting tables in frontier saloons for more than 20 years, and her intuition for danger was as sharp as any gambler's card sense. Martha began moving toward the corner table, her weathered hands already reaching for the bar towel she used as both cleaning tool and peace offering. She had defused more than her share of confrontations over the years, usually with a combination of motherly authority and free whiskey. Wade's irritation was rapidly transforming into something uglier. His reputation demanded that challenges be met with overwhelming force, and this old fool's quiet defiance felt like a challenge. The other patrons had begun to take notice, conversations trailing off as they sensed the shift in atmosphere. The Ace Morrison show was about to begin, and everyone knew it rarely ended with handshakes and apologies. "Now hold on there, gentlemen," Martha called out as she approached, her voice carrying the practiced authority of a woman who had spent decades managing drunk cowboys and volatile tempers. "Let's not let this evening get out of hand over nothing." Wade's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with the kind of anger that came from wounded pride. The old woman's interference was the final insult, suggesting that he couldn't handle one broken-down ranch hand without help. "Nobody asked for your opinion, old woman," Wade snarled, his hand shooting out to grab Martha's wrist with unnecessary force. His fingers dug into the thin flesh above her bones, drawing a sharp intake of breath from the elderly woman. "Why don't you mind your own business before you get hurt?" The old-timer's whiskey glass stopped halfway to his lips. For just a moment, something flickered behind those wire-rimmed spectacles, something cold and measuring that seemed at odds with his humble appearance. His voice, when he spoke, had lost its casual drawl and carried a quiet authority that cut through the saloon's ambient noise like a blade. "Let the lady go, son." The words hung in the air like gun smoke, quiet but unmistakably final. Wade Morrison's grip on Martha's wrist loosened slightly, though whether from surprise at being addressed so calmly or simple reflex, even he couldn't say. The old-timer hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any threatening gestures, but something in that simple request carried weight that pressed against Wade's chest like a physical thing. Martha pulled her wrist free and stepped back, rubbing the red marks where Wade's fingers had gripped too tightly. She shot a grateful glance toward the old-timer, who acknowledged her with the barest nod before returning his attention to his whiskey glass. The moment stretched like a bowstring, every patron in the broken while holding their collective breath. Wade's face flushed red beneath his carefully groomed mustache. Being dismissed so casually by some broken-down saddle tramp was an insult he couldn't stomach, especially with his reputation hanging in the balance. But something about the old man's steady calm gave him pause, like staring into the barrel of a gun and wondering if it was loaded. The ace forced his practiced smile back into place and turned away from the corner table, his boots clicking against the floorboards as he returned to his poker game. But the sting of embarrassment burned in his chest like bad whiskey, and he knew it would fester until he found a way to reassert his dominance. No broken-down cowpoke was going to show him up in front of his associates and live to tell about it. The poker game resumed with Wade dealing the cards with more aggression than artistry, his usual smooth confidence replaced by barely contained anger. His four associates had positioned themselves strategically around the saloon, their hands resting casually near their weapons. They had worked with the ace long enough to recognize the signs of his temper building toward violence, and they knew their role in the coming performance. The old-timer continued nursing his whiskey, but his pale eyes tracked every movement at the poker table with the intensity of a hawk watching field mice. He noted the way Wade's left hand occasionally dipped below the table's edge, the subtle pause before dealing from the bottom of the deck, the practiced misdirection that accompanied each sleight of hand. In his younger days, he had seen enough crooked games to recognize a master at work, though this particular master was letting his emotions cloud his judgment. Wade's next victim was a leather merchant from Austin, a nervous man with soft hands who clearly had more money than card sense. The ace took him for $30 in the first three hands, his technique growing bolder as his anger sought outlet through his craft. By the fourth hand, Wade was dealing seconds so obviously that even the merchant began to shift uncomfortably in his chair. The fifth hand should have been Wade's masterpiece, a carefully orchestrated swindle that would have netted him the merchant's remaining stake. But fortune, as it sometimes does, decided to remind everyone that even loaded dice occasionally show the wrong numbers. The merchant's nervous fidgeting had disturbed Wade's rhythm just enough to cause a fumble, and when the cards were revealed, the soft-handed Austin man held a legitimate straight flush against Wade's carefully constructed full house. The silence that followed was deafening. Wade stared at the cards as if they had personally betrayed him, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally rage. His associates tensed, recognizing the dangerous stillness that preceded their employer's violent outbursts. "You cheated," Wade announced, his voice cutting through the saloon's ambient noise like a cleaver through bone. The accusation hung in the air, ridiculous in its hypocrisy, but deadly serious in its implications. The merchant's face went pale as milk, his soft hands beginning to tremble. "I don't know how to cheat, mister," the merchant stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just played the cards you dealt me." Wade's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and several patrons began edging toward the doors. The Broken Wool had seen its share of violence over the years, and the smart money was on being somewhere else when the shooting started. From his corner table, the old-timer's voice cut through the tension with the calm authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Might be your luck's changing, not the cards." Every head in the saloon turned toward the corner where the weathered old man sat with his barely touched whiskey. Wade's rage, which had been building toward the merchant, suddenly had a new target. The old-timer met his gaze with those pale blue eyes, showing no more concern than if he had commented on the weather. "What did you say, old man?" Wade growled, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "Said it might be your luck changing," the old-timer repeated, his voice carrying that same unhurried drawl. "Cards got a way of humbling a man when he gets too sure of himself." The words hit Wade like a physical blow. Here was this nobody, this broken-down ranch hand, daring to suggest that Wade Morrison could be anything less than a master of his craft. The insult burned worse because it carried a grain of uncomfortable truth. Wade had been sloppy, letting his anger cloud his judgment, and this old fool had apparently been watching closely enough to notice. Wade's four associates began moving with practiced coordination, drifting away from their positions near the bar and the far tables to form a loose circle around the old-timer's corner. They had performed this dance many times before, the careful choreography of intimidation that preceded violence. Their hands rested openly on their gun butts now, no longer bothering with the pretense of casual positioning. The old-timer seemed oblivious to the danger closing around him, taking another slow sip of his whiskey, as if he had all the time in the world. His weathered hands showed no tremor, no sign of the fear that should have been coursing through any reasonable man's veins. If anything, he seemed almost bored by the proceedings, like a patron waiting for a particularly dull theater performance to reach its conclusion. Wade approached the corner table with deliberate menace, his expensive boots striking the floorboards like a judge's gavel. The saloon had grown tomb quiet, even the piano player having abandoned his post for safer ground near the back exit. Martha had retreated behind the bar, though she watched the proceedings with the fascination of someone witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. "You got something to say about my game, old-timer?" Wade demanded, looming over the seated figure like a storm cloud. His shadow fell across the table, blocking the lamplight and casting the old man's features into deeper relief. "Just making conversation," the old-timer replied, his voice carrying no hint of apology or fear. "Man gets to be my age, he sees patterns in things. Cards, weather, human nature. All got their rhythms if you know how to look." The casual dismissal was more than Wade could bear. His carefully constructed reputation, built on equal parts skill and brutality, demanded a response that would remind everyone in the Broken Wheel exactly who they were dealing with. His arms swept across the small table with vicious intent, sending the old-timer's whiskey glass spinning through the air to shatter against the far wall. The sound of breaking glass seemed to release some of the tension in the room, though it was immediately replaced by something far more dangerous. The old-timer looked at the spreading puddle of amber liquid, then at the broken shards glittering in the lamplight, before finally raising his eyes to meet Wade's triumphant gaze. Slowly, with the deliberate care of a man whose joints had earned their stiffness through decades of hard use, the old-timer rose from his chair. He was taller than he had appeared while seated, his frame carrying the kind of lean strength that came from a lifetime of physical labor. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine regret that somehow made it more unsettling than any threat could have been. "That whiskey cost me 2 bits, son." Wade threw back his head and laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. 2 bits, he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. 2 whole bits, and here I thought you might be somebody worth worrying about. You're just another broke old buzzard counting pennies. The old-timer stood perfectly still, his pale eyes never leaving Wade's face. Something had shifted in his posture, though it was so subtle that only the most observant might have noticed. His shoulders had squared almost imperceptibly, and his weight had settled onto the balls of his feet in a way that suggested coiled readiness rather than old age. Wade's hand moved with the speed of a striking snake, his palm connecting with the old-timer's cheek in a sharp crack that echoed through the silent saloon. The force of the blow knocked the wire-rimmed spectacles from the old man's face, sending them skittering across the floorboards to land near the base of the bar. The old-timer's head rocked with the impact, and when he turned back to face Wade, a thin line of blood had appeared at the corner of his mouth. The saloon held its collective breath, waiting for the old man to crumple, to beg, to show the proper deference that Wade's violence demanded. Instead, the old-timer bent slowly to retrieve his spectacles, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the 4 armed men surrounding him. He examined the wire frames for damage before cleaning the lenses on his shirt with the same methodical care a jeweler might show to a precious stone. When he placed them back on his nose, his pale eyes seemed somehow different, as if the removal of the glasses had allowed something to surface that had been carefully hidden. Martha, watching from behind the bar, felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening's temperature. There was something about the way the old-timer moved now, a precision and control that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance. His hands, she noticed with growing unease, weren't shaking despite the violence he had just endured. Wade stepped back, his gold teeth gleaming in a predatory grin as he surveyed his handiwork. The sight of blood on the old-timer's lip filled him with the same satisfaction he felt when a particularly difficult mark finally folded under pressure. This was how things were supposed to go, how the natural order asserted itself when upstarts forgot their place. "What are you going to do about it, old man?" Wade taunted, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of mock invitation. The question hung in the air like a challenge, though Wade clearly expected nothing more than stammered apologies and a hasty retreat toward the batwing doors. The old-timer finished adjusting his spectacles and looked up at Wade with those pale blue eyes that now seemed to carry depths that hadn't been there moments before. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried through the silent saloon like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. "Boy, you just made the last mistake of your short life." The words settled into the silence of the broken wheel saloon like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease through every soul present. Wade Morrison's triumphant grin began to waver as he studied the old-timer's face, searching for the fear and submission that should have followed such a beating. Instead, he found something that made his stomach clench with the first cold fingers of doubt. The old-timer straightened his spectacles with movements that were no longer those of a frail ranch hand nursing aching joints. His shoulders squared with a precision that spoke of military bearing, and when he lifted his head to meet Wade's gaze, the pale blue eyes behind those wire frames had transformed into something altogether more dangerous. The blood at the corner of his mouth remained, but he made no move to wipe it away, wearing it instead like war paint. Behind the bar, young Tommy McLean felt his world tilt sideways as recognition dawned with the force of a physical blow. At 19, Tommy had been tending bar at the Broken Wheel for barely 6 months, but he had grown up on stories of the territory's legendary lawmen. His grandfather had been a cavalry scout during the Apache campaigns, and the old man's tales of frontier justice had filled Tommy's childhood with larger-than-life figures who walked the thin line between civilization and chaos. The way the old-timer held himself now, the subtle but unmistakable shift from victim to predator, triggered memories of his grandfather's most whispered stories. Tommy's face drained of color as the pieces fell into place, his hands beginning to tremble as he gripped the bar's edge for support. "Sweet Jesus," Tommy breathed, his voice barely audible but carrying in the tomb-like silence of the saloon. "That's Samuel Hayes." The name hit the gathered crowd like a physical force, rippling outward in shocked whispers and barely suppressed gasps. Samuel Hayes, the gravedigger. Even men who had never set foot outside San Antonio knew that name, knew the stories that followed it like shadows across the frontier. Conversations that had been frozen by Wade's violence now resumed in urgent undertones as patrons shared fragments of legend and half-remembered tales. Wade's confidence cracked like poorly tempered steel, though his pride refused to let him acknowledge what his instincts were screaming. That name, whispered with such obvious terror by the young bartender, meant nothing to him. It had to mean nothing, because the alternative was unthinkable. Wade Morrison, the ace, terror of gambling halls from El Paso to Austin, could not have just slapped a living legend. "That name don't mean nothing to me," Wade declared, but his voice lacked the commanding authority it had carried moments before. His four associates shifted nervously, their hands still on their weapons, but their eyes now filled with the kind of uncertainty that preceded very bad decisions. The old-timer, Samuel Hayes, began removing his worn jacket with movements that were deliberate and unhurried. Beneath the simple cotton shirt, his forearms bore a roadmap of scars that spoke of violence survived and violence delivered. Some were clean and surgical, the kind left by knives wielded with precision. Others were jagged and brutal, souvenirs of close encounters with bullets and shrapnel. His hands, no longer disguised by the tremor of supposed old age, moved with the controlled grace of a man who had spent decades making life and death decisions in the span of heartbeats. The jacket fell to the floor beside his chair, and with it seemed to go the last pretense of the humble ranch hand who had been quietly nursing his whiskey. In its place stood something that made hardened gunfighters reach for their weapons not out of aggression, but out of the desperate hope that steel and powder might somehow even odds that had just shifted beyond all reasonable calculation. 37 years I wore a badge, Hayes said, his voice stripped of the folksy drawl that had marked his earlier speech. The words came out flat and cold, each syllable delivered with the precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Federal Marshal, Territory of Texas. Before that, Cavalry Scout in the Apache Wars. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of chairs scraping against floorboards as patrons edged toward exits with the careful movements of people trying not to wake sleeping predators. Martha had gone pale behind the bar, her weathered hands pressed against her mouth as if to hold back words that might shatter the fragile peace that still existed in these final moments before violence claimed the night. Hayes reached into his shirt and withdrew something that caught the lamplight with the dull gleam of well-worn metal. The badge was tarnished with age and wear, its star shape bearing the scratches and dents of hard service. But the authority it represented was unmistakable, carrying with it the weight of federal law and the promise of justice delivered with lead and steel. "I killed 43 men in the line of duty," Hayes continued, his pale eyes never leaving Wade's face. "Each one earned it. Each one got a proper burial with their name carved in stone and words spoken over their graves. Been retired 8 years now, living quiet on a little spread north of here. Promised my late wife I'd hang up my guns and let younger men carry the burden of keeping the peace." Wade's mouth had gone dry as desert sand, his tongue feeling thick and clumsy as he tried to form words that might somehow undo the catastrophe that was bearing down on him like a runaway freight train. The stories were coming back to him now, fragments of saloon talk and whispered warnings about the legendary marshal who had tamed the wildest sections of the territory through a combination of tactical brilliance and absolutely ruthless efficiency. The gravedigger, they had called him, though never to his face. Not because he dug graves, but because he filled them with such methodical regularity that undertakers across the territory had learned to keep extra pine boxes in stock whenever Samuel Hayes rode into their towns. 43 confirmed kills, each one documented and justified, each one a testament to what happened when evil men pushed civilization past its breaking point. Hayes reached behind his back and withdrew a single Colt .45, its blue steel barrel worn smooth by decades of use, but maintained with the loving care of a craftsman's favorite tool. The weapon seemed almost alive in his hands, an extension of his will that had spoken the final word in 43 separate conversations between justice and chaos. "But you slapped me, boy," Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "And you hurt Martha. Some things a man can't let slide, no matter what promises he's made to the dead." Wade's four associates began backing toward the doors with movements that were anything but subtle, their loyalty to their employer crumbling in the face of mathematics that no amount of money could alter. For guns against Samuel Hayes was poor odds on the best of days, and this clearly wasn't going to be one of their better days. The youngest of the group, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, was the first to break completely. His nerves shattered like cheap glass as he turned and bolted for the batwing doors, his boots pounding against the floorboards in desperate rhythm. Hayes watched him go with something that might have been approval, a slight nod that acknowledged the wisdom of knowing when to walk away from a fight that couldn't be won. Martha found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Samuel," she said, the single word carrying decades of recognition and respect. The old-timer's head turned toward her, and for just a moment his expression softened with something approaching warmth. "Martha," he replied, his voice losing some of its deadly edge. "You still make the best coffee between here and El Paso. Didn't expect to see you still working at your age. Had to keep busy after Henry passed," she answered, her hands still trembling as she gripped the bar. "You know how it is when you lose the person who gave your life meaning." Hayes nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared prayer for the dead. His Elizabeth had been gone 8 years now, claimed by the consumption that had ravaged her lungs despite the best care he could provide. Her death had marked the end of his career as a federal marshal, the moment when he had finally hung up his guns in favor of a quiet life that honored her memory. But some promises, he reflected as he turned his attention back to Wade Morrison and his remaining associates, were harder to keep than others. Elizabeth had understood the man she married, had known that his sense of justice burned like a forge fire that could never be completely banked. She would have forgiven him this one last dance with violence, especially in defense of an old friend who had shown them both kindness during their brief time in San Antonio. Wade's face had gone pale as milk, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening's relative coolness. The gold teeth that had gleamed so confidently in his predatory smile now seemed garish and foolish, like costume jewelry on a man playing at being something he could never truly become. His hand moved toward his gun, then stopped, then moved again, caught in the paralysis of a man who suddenly understood that every choice before him led to the same inevitable conclusion. "Walk away, Wade," Hayes said quietly, though his tone made it clear this was the only mercy that would be offered. "Take your boys and walk away. Find another town, another game, another life. But if you reach for that gun, if you make me do what I've done 43 times before, then this ends only one way." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, final and unforgiving. Wade Morrison, the ace, terror of gambling halls and nightmare of honest players, stood at the crossroads between life and death with only his pride and his reputation to guide him toward what everyone in the saloon already knew would be the wrong choice. Time seemed suspended in amber as the moment stretched toward its breaking point, every soul in the Broken Wheel Saloon holding their breath as they witnessed the final seconds before Samuel Hayes, the gravedigger, reminded the world why legends never truly die. Wade Morrison's hand froze halfway to his gun as the weight of Samuel Hayes' reputation settled over him like a burial shroud. The stories were flooding back now, whispered tales from saloons and gambling halls across the territory, each one more terrifying than the last. The gravedigger hadn't earned his nickname through luck or bluster, but through the methodical precision with which he had carved his legend into the frontier's violent history. But pride, That most dangerous of human failings rarely yields to wisdom when a man's reputation hangs in the balance. Wade's face twisted into a snarl that was equal parts desperation and denial, his voice cracking as he tried to summon the commanding presence that had served him so well in the past. "You're bluffing, old man," Wade declared, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the fear that was eating at his courage like acid on steel. "All those stories, they're just talk. Campfire tales to scare green kids and traveling salesmen." Hayes tilted his head slightly, studying Wade with the detached interest of a doctor examining a particularly interesting specimen of disease. The Colt remained steady in his weathered hand, its barrel pointing downward but ready to rise in the fraction of a second that separated life from death. The old marshal's pale eyes began moving in a slow, deliberate pattern, cataloging every detail of the tactical situation with the professional competence that had kept him alive through 3 decades of frontier justice. His gaze swept across Wade's 3 remaining associates, noting their positions, their weapons, their tells, and most importantly, their weaknesses. "I count 4 of you," Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying the conversational tone of a man discussing the weather. "I count 1 bullet for each." The words hit Wade's remaining gang like physical blows, each man suddenly aware that they were being evaluated not as individuals, but as problems to be solved with lead and powder. The casual certainty in Hayes' voice was more unsettling than any shouted threat could have been, promising death delivered with the same professional efficiency a carpenter might show when driving nails. Hayes turned his attention to the first of Wade's associates, a heavy-set man with graying hair who stood near the saloon's back door. "You'd be Bronson, if I'm not mistaken," Hayes said, his tone carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being right about such things. "Took a Comanche arrow in that left leg down near Presidio, maybe 6 years back. Still favors it when the weather turns cold." Bronson's face went white as freshly fallen snow, his hand instinctively moving to touch his left thigh, where an arrowhead had nearly ended his career as hired muscle. The old wound had indeed been troubling him lately, the autumn chill making it ache in ways that reminded him of his own mortality. How could this old marshal possibly know about an injury that had happened in a skirmish most folks had never even heard about? "That favoring's gonna make you slow on the draw," Hayes continued with clinical detachment. "By the time you clear leather, I'll have put 2 rounds center mass and moved on to your friend by the piano." The second man, positioned near the saloon's old upright piano, shifted nervously as Hayes' attention settled on him like the weight of a tombstone. This one was younger, maybe 30, with the kind of lean build that suggested speed over strength. But Hayes had been reading men's souls through their bodies for longer than this gunslinger had been alive, and what he saw wasn't promising. "You got a tremor in that right hand, son," Hayes observed, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were commenting on the color of the sky. "Whiskey shakes, if I'm any judge. Probably been hitting the bottle harder since you took up with Wade here. Can't say I blame you, considering the company, but it's gonna throw your aim off something fierce when the shooting starts." The young gunman's right hand began trembling more violently, as if Hayes' words had given the shakes permission to manifest more obviously. He tried to steady himself by gripping his gun but tighter, but that only made the tremor more pronounced, confirming the marshal's assessment with devastating accuracy. Hayes' gaze moved to the third man, who had positioned himself near the far wall in what he probably thought was a tactical advantage. This one was trying to look casual, his hand resting near a shoulder holster that bulged obviously beneath his vest. But Hayes had seen that particular mistake more times than he cared to count, usually in the moments before some would-be gunfighter learned why cross-draw holsters were the choice of men who wanted to die young. "Cross-draw setup," Hayes noted with the same professional interest a teacher might show when correcting a student's poor penmanship. "Looks impressive, feels comfortable when you're sitting around planning mischief. But in close quarters like this, you'll tangle that barrel on your vest before you clear the holster. Gives me enough time to put a bullet through your heart and reload for the next dance partner." The man by the wall swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a fishing cork in rough water. He had indeed chosen the cross-draw holster because it looked intimidating, never considering the tactical disadvantages it presented in the kind of close-quarters violence that was about to erupt in the Broken Wheel's confines. Wade himself was becoming increasingly desperate as he watched his carefully assembled gang of killers being systematically dismantled through nothing more than professional observation and brutal honesty. These men had followed him across half the territory, had backed his play in a dozen towns, had built their own reputations on their association with the Ace Morrison. Now they were being reduced to nervous amateurs by an old man with pale eyes and a voice like winter wind. The fourth member of Wade's gang, barely out of his teens with peach fuzz on his cheeks and fear in his eyes, stood closest to the Batwing doors. Hayes studied him for a long moment before his expression softened almost imperceptibly, revealing something that might have been paternal concern beneath the marshal's professional facade. "You're just a kid," Hayes said quietly, his voice losing some of its deadly edge. "Maybe 19, 20 at the outside. Still got time to make better choices than the ones that brought you to this moment. Walk away now, son. Walk away and live to see your next birthday." The young man's resolve cracked like thin ice under spring sunshine. His hand moved away from his gun, and he took a tentative step toward the doors, then another, then broke into a stumbling run that carried him out into the San Antonio night. Hayes nodded approvingly, pleased that at least one life might be saved from the carnage that was rapidly approaching. But Wade Morrison, the ace, terror of gambling halls and nightmare of honest players, had finally reached the end of his psychological endurance. With his gang reduced by desertion and demoralized by Hayes' clinical assessment of their weaknesses, desperation drove him to the kind of tactical mistake that separated the living from the dead in frontier gunfights. Wade's hand moved with surprising speed, not toward the gun at his hip, but toward a small derringer concealed in his vest pocket. The two-shot weapon appeared in his grasp like a magician's trick, its nickel plate barrel gleaming in the saloon's lamplight as he grabbed Martha around the throat and pressed the gun against her temple. "Back off," Wade snarled, his voice cracking with the strain of a man who had played his final card and knew it was a losing hand. "Back off, or the old woman dies right here, right now." Martha's weathered hands came up to clutch at Wade's arm, though whether in fear or defiance was impossible to determine. Her eyes found Hayes' pale gaze across the saloon's smoky interior, and in them the old marshal saw not terror, but a quiet resignation that spoke of a woman who had lived long enough to understand that some things were worth dying for. Hayes' response was delivered in the same conversational tone he might have used to order a drink, his voice carrying no more emotional weight than if Wade had commented on the evening's temperature. "That's a two-shot derringer, son. You fire once, you got one bullet left. I got 6 in the cylinder and a full belt of ammunition. Math doesn't favor you." The casual dismissal of his threat hit Wade like a physical blow, his carefully planned hostage situation reduced to arithmetic by a man who had clearly faced similar scenarios more times than he cared to count. But Hayes wasn't finished with his tactical assessment, his pale eyes studying the situation with the same professional detachment he had shown when evaluating Wade's associates. More than that, Hayes continued, his voice never rising above that deadly conversational tone, "You're scared. Scared men twitch. Scared men make mistakes. That derringer's got a 2-pound trigger pull. Takes deliberate pressure to fire. Your hand's shaking so bad you're likely to shoot yourself in the foot before you manage to hurt Martha." Wade's gun hand was indeed trembling, though whether from fear, rage, or the simple physical strain of maintaining his grip on both weapon and hostage was impossible to determine. What was certain was that Hayes' words were having their intended effect, undermining Wade's confidence in his own ability to control the situation he had created. The remaining patrons of the Broken Wheel had pressed themselves against the walls or taken shelter behind overturned tables, their faces reflecting the kind of fascinated horror that came from witnessing history in the making. They were watching Samuel Hayes, the gravedigger, demonstrate why his legend had survived his retirement, why his name was still whispered with respect and fear in saloons across the territory. Hayes began moving with deliberate slowness, his weathered hands reaching for the gun belt around his waist. Wade tensed, pressing the derringer harder against Martha's temple. But the old marshal's movements were so obviously non-threatening that even a man as desperate as Wade could see that no immediate danger was being presented. "I'm 64 years old," Hayes said as he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the silent saloon. "My joints ache every morning when I get out of bed. My eyes ain't what they were when I was tracking Apaches through the Chizos Mountains. Sometimes I forget where I put my hat or what I had for breakfast the day before. The confession seemed to breathe new life into Wade's confidence, his grip on Martha tightening as he sensed weakness in his legendary opponent. But Hayes wasn't finished with his revelation, and what came next would haunt Wade Morrison's final moments for however long those moments might last. But muscle memory, Hayes continued, his pale eyes never leaving Wade's face, that stays with a man. 43 times I've drawn this gun in anger. 43 times I've looked a man in the eye and made the decision that ended his life. You think age has made me forget how to kill, boy? You're about to learn just how wrong you can be. Wade's face had gone gray as ash, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Hayes' quiet certainty. The derringer in his hand seemed suddenly inadequate, a child's toy brought to bear against a force of nature that had been dealing death since before Wade Morrison was old enough to know what fear meant. Then you're gonna die slow, old fool, Wade managed to croak, though his voice lacked any conviction whatsoever. Hayes smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun, a cold expression that held no warmth or humor, but rather the satisfied anticipation of a craftsman about to demonstrate his mastery of a particularly challenging piece of work. Son, he said quietly, every Undertaker from El Paso to Houston knows my name. You know why? The question hung in the smoky air of the broken wheel like the promise of Judgment Day, and Samuel Hayes let it settle into every corner of the saloon before providing the answer that would haunt Wade Morrison's final minutes on Earth. They know my name, Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth, because I always brought them business. Clean kills, neat and tidy. Never left a man to suffer or bleed out slow. One shot, center mass, quick and professional. 43 graves I filled across this territory, and 43 families got their boys back for proper burial, instead of leaving them for the buzzards and coyotes. The words hit Wade like a physical blow, each syllable driving home the reality of what he was facing. This wasn't some broken-down ranch hand or washed-up lawman trading on past glories. This was Samuel Hayes in his element, the legendary gravedigger preparing to add one more chapter to a story written in gunpowder and blood. Hayes' pale eyes never left Wade's face as he continued his grim recitation. Every man I killed earned his death through choices he made, through lines he crossed that no civilized person should cross. Rapists, murderers, men who preyed on the innocent and the weak. Men like you, Wade Morrison, who think fear and violence give them the right to take what they please from folks just trying to live their lives in peace. Wade's grip on Martha had grown so tight that his knuckles showed white against the Derringer's nickel plating, but his confidence was crumbling like a house built on sand. The 3 remaining members of his gang shifted nervously, their earlier bravado replaced by the dawning understanding that they had attached themselves to a man whose reputation was about to get them all killed. But Hayes wasn't finished with his psychological dismantling of Wade's remaining courage. The old marshal's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone in the saloon to strain forward to catch his words. Difference between you and them other 43, Hayes said, his tone carrying the weight of absolute judgment, is that most of them went down fighting. Had the courage of their convictions, misguided as those convictions might have been. You're hiding behind an old woman like a coward, using her life as a shield because you ain't man enough to face what's coming. The words struck Wade like whip cuts, each observation flaying away another layer of the false courage that had carried him through years of bullying weaker opponents. Martha, despite her precarious position, managed to find her voice in the deadly silence that followed. Don't let him win, Sam, she said quietly, her words carrying no fear despite the cold metal pressed against her temple. Her faith in the legendary marshal was absolute, built on years of frontier wisdom that taught survival often depended on choosing the right side when violence became inevitable. Hayes acknowledged her courage with the slightest nod, his pale eyes conveying a respect and gratitude that needed no words. Martha had been kind to him and Elizabeth during their brief time in San Antonio, had treated them with the dignity that good people deserved regardless of their circumstances. That kindness had earned his protection, and Samuel Hayes had never failed to honor such debts. Wade's nerve finally shattered completely under the combined weight of Hayes' psychological assault and his own mounting terror. His voice cracked as he screamed at his remaining associates, desperation driving him to the kind of tactical blunder that separated the living from the dead in frontier gunfights. "Take him," Wade shrieked, his carefully controlled facade dissolving into panic. "Kill him now, before he kills us all." The command released his 3 remaining men from the paralysis of fear that had held them frozen, though their responses revealed exactly why Hayes had assessed them so accurately. Bronson, the heavy-set gunman with the wounded leg, drew first, but his compromised mobility threw off his balance. His shot went wide, the bullet embedding itself in the saloon's ceiling as Hayes moved with fluid precision that belied his claimed age and infirmity. The old marshal's movement was economy personified, every gesture serving multiple purposes as he closed the distance between himself and Bronson with the smooth flow of water finding its level. His weathered hand struck Bronson's wrist with surgical precision, the impact sending the gunman's weapon spinning across the floorboards while numbing his fingers with the kind of pain that came from expertly applied pressure to nerve clusters. Bronson's agonized cry was cut short as Hayes' elbow found his solar plexus with devastating accuracy, dropping the heavy-set man to his knees as his diaphragm spasmed and refused to function. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, and Hayes was already moving toward his next target before Bronson hit the floor. The second gunman, the one with the whiskey shakes, managed to clear his holster, but his trembling hands betrayed him exactly as Hayes had predicted. His shot went low and to the right, gouging a furrow in the floorboards near Hayes' boots while the old marshal continued his deadly ballet with movements that seemed choreographed by death itself. Hayes had appropriated a wooden chair during his encounter with Bronson, and now he wielded it with the same professional competence he had once shown with badge and gun. The chair's legs caught the shaky gunman's weapon hand with bone-crushing force, the impact sending the gun flying while breaking at least 2 fingers with audible snaps that made several patrons wince in sympathetic pain. The chair continued its arc, splintering against the gunman's shoulder and sending him spinning into the saloon's far wall, where he collapsed in a heap of groaning misery. Hayes discarded the remains of his improvised weapon and turned his attention to the third member of Wade's rapidly diminishing gang. The crossdraw specialist had finally managed to clear his shoulder holster, but his weapon snagged on his vest exactly as Hayes had predicted, giving the old marshal the precious seconds he needed to close the distance between them. Hayes' approach was inexorable, his pale eyes fixed on his target with the focused intensity of a predator that had identified its prey. The gunman's shot, when it finally came, was rushed and panicked, the bullet passing so close to Hayes' head that it parted his gray hair without breaking his stride. The old marshal's response was delivered with the casual efficiency of a man swatting a troublesome fly, his fist connecting with the gunman's jaw in a perfectly executed uppercut that lifted the man off his feet before depositing him unconscious on the sawdust-covered floor. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 armed men reduced to groaning casualties by an old marshal who moved with the deadly grace of a man half his age. Wade Morrison watched the systematic destruction of his gang with growing horror, his derringer shaking so violently in his grip that Martha had to steady herself against his trembling. Hayes turned his attention back to Wade with the same professional calm he had maintained throughout the violence, his breathing barely elevated despite the physical exertion of dismantling 3 opponents. He moved toward Wade and Martha with slow deliberation, his empty hands held slightly away from his body in a gesture that was somehow more threatening than if he had been bristling with weapons. "Your turn, boy," Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Martha's done nothing to deserve dying for your cowardice, and we both know you ain't got the sand to pull that trigger anyway." Wade's face twisted with rage and desperation as he realized the truth in Hayes' assessment. The derringer felt like a lead weight in his shaking hands, its 2 shots representing his final chance to salvage something from the catastrophe his arrogance had created. But Hayes' pale eyes seemed to look right through him, reading his thoughts and finding them as inadequate as everything else about Wade Morrison. Martha, showing the kind of courage that had carried frontier women through decades of hardship and danger, made her own contribution to the final resolution. With a sudden twist that caught Wade completely off guard, She broke free from his trembling grip and stumbled toward the safety of the bar, leaving Wade exposed and alone with his inadequate weapon and his crumbling courage. The derringer in Wade's hand seemed to gain weight as he found himself facing Samuel Hayes across the length of the Broken Wheel's main floor. The legendary marshal stood perfectly still, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his pale eyes never wavering from Wade's face. There was no anger in that gaze, no hatred or desire for revenge, only the cold professional assessment of a man who had faced this moment 43 times before and knew exactly how it would end. Wade's shot, when it finally came, was the product of pure panic rather than tactical thinking. The derringer bucked in his shaking hands, its small caliber bullet flying wide of its intended target to shatter a whiskey bottle behind the bar. The sound of breaking glass seemed to release the last of Wade's courage, leaving him staring at the smoking weapon in his hands with the dawning realization that he had just fired his final shot. Hayes' movement was poetry written in violence, his weathered hand dropping to the discarded gun belt at his feet and drawing the Colt .45 in a motion so fluid it seemed to bend the laws of physics. The weapon appeared in his grip as if summoned by will alone, its barrel rising with the inevitability of sunrise to center on Wade's chest. The shot, when it came, was delivered with the same professional precision that had marked all of Hayes' work throughout his legendary career. The .45 caliber bullet took Wade's center mass, exactly as promised, the impact spinning him around and dropping him to the sawdust-covered floor where he lay gasping like a landed fish. Hayes approached the fallen man with the same careful deliberation he had shown throughout the confrontation, his weapon held ready but no longer aimed with lethal intent. Wade's eyes, wide with shock and the growing realization of his mortality, found Hayes' face as the old marshal knelt beside him. "What's your real name, son?" Hayes asked quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness that spoke of mercy even in the moment of ultimate judgment. "Your mama should know where you're buried, should be able to visit your grave and say proper words over your remains." Wade's mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to force out the words that would mark his final act of honesty in a life built on deception and violence. "Billy," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own labored breathing. "Billy Garrett, from a little farm outside Houston." Hayes nodded gravely, filing away the information with the same care he had once shown when completing federal reports on his official kills. "I'll make sure the stone says beloved son instead of card cheat," he promised, his words carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "Your mama will have a place to grieve proper, and folks will remember Billy Garrett instead of Wade Morrison." The light in Billy Garrett's eyes faded like a candle guttering in the wind, his final breath carrying with it the last echoes of a life that had chosen the wrong path and paid the ultimate price for that choice. Hayes remained kneeling beside the body for several heartbeats, his pale eyes closed as he added one more name to the long list of men whose deaths would follow him to his own grave. When he finally stood, Samuel Hayes looked every one of his 64 years, the weight of accumulated violence pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The legendary gravedigger had claimed his 44th victim, and the cost of that claim showed in every line of his weathered face as he surveyed the aftermath of Wade Morrison's final gamble. The silence that settled over the Broken Wheel Saloon in the aftermath of gunfire was different from the tense quiet that had preceded the violence. This was the profound stillness that followed the conclusion of something inevitable, the moment when death claimed its due and left the living to contemplate the fragility of their own existence. Samuel Hayes stood over Billy Garrett's still form, his weathered hands carefully holstering the Colt .45 that had just added another name to his grim tally. The legendary marshal's pale eyes swept across the saloon's interior, taking in the groaning forms of Billy's surviving associates and the wide-eyed faces of patrons who had just witnessed frontier justice delivered with surgical precision. Martha approached slowly from behind the bar, her weathered features reflecting a mixture of gratitude and sorrow that spoke to the complex emotions that violence, even justified violence, inevitably stirred in decent people. She knelt beside Billy Garrett's body with the practiced movements of a woman who had seen too much death in her years on the frontier, her fingers gently closing the young man's staring eyes. "He wasn't more than 25, she observed quietly, her voice carrying the kind of maternal sadness that mourned wasted potential even in the face of necessary justice. Somebody's boy, somebody's hope for the future. Makes you wonder what choices might have led him down a different path. Hayes nodded gravely, understanding the wisdom in her words. Every man he had killed over the course of his career had started as somebody's child, somebody's son with dreams and possibilities that had somehow been corrupted by circumstance, poor judgment, or simple moral weakness. It was a burden that grew heavier with each passing year, the weight of accumulated deaths pressing against his conscience like stones in a saddlebag. The local sheriff arrived within minutes of the shooting, his boots striking the floorboards with the urgent rhythm of a lawman responding to violence in his jurisdiction. Sheriff Dan Holloway was a competent man in his 40s, experienced enough to recognize the aftermath of a justified killing when he saw it, but young enough to still feel awed in the presence of genuine frontier legend. "Samuel Hayes," Holloway said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and professional courtesy. "Heard you'd retired from the life. Figured you were raising cattle up north somewhere." "Was raising cattle," Hayes replied, his tone revealing nothing of the internal struggle that had preceded his return to violence. "Still am, far as that goes. Just had some business to conclude here in San Antonio." The sheriff's investigation was perfunctory, the testimony of 24 witnesses making it clear that Hayes had acted in defense of Martha and his own life. Billy Garrett's reputation as a cardsharp and gunman was well known to local law enforcement, and his associates bore enough outstanding warrants to keep them in custody long enough for their broken bones to heal properly. Hayes paid for the damage to the saloon out of his own pocket, covering the cost of broken furniture, spilled liquor, and the cleanup required to remove the blood from the floorboards. He also left money with Martha to ensure that Billy Garrett received a proper burial with a decent headstone, fulfilling his promise to a dying man regardless of that man's crimes. "The whiskey's on the house tonight, Sam," Martha told him as the crowd began to thin and normal conversation slowly resumed. "Least I can do after what you did for me." Hayes accepted the drink with a nod of thanks, though he barely touched the amber liquid as he sat in his corner table and reflected on the evening's events. The return to violence, even violence as justified as this, felt like a betrayal of the promise he had made to Elizabeth on her deathbed. She had wanted him to find peace, to leave behind the badge and gun that had defined so much of their marriage. But some promises, he reflected as he watched Martha efficiently restore order to her establishment, were harder to keep than others. Elizabeth would have understood his actions tonight, would have known that her husband could no more walk away from injustice than he could stop breathing. It was both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden, the moral compass that had made him a legend and a man haunted by the ghosts of 44 graves. 3 weeks later, Hayes found himself standing in San Antonio's modest cemetery, his hat in his hands as he looked down at a simple granite headstone that read, "William Garrett, beloved son, 186-21887. The stone was well crafted and properly placed, its inscription conveying dignity rather than the shameful truth of how Billy had lived his final years. A woman in black approached across the cemetery's carefully tended paths, her movements carrying the measured pace of someone carrying a burden too heavy for easy transport. She was perhaps 50 years of age, her face bearing the kind of weathered beauty that came from decades of frontier hardship tempered by unshakable faith. "Marshall Hayes," she said quietly, her voice carrying the soft accent of East Texas. "I'm Sarah Garrett, Billy's mother. I got your letter about his passing." Hayes turned to face her, his pale eyes reflecting the same mixture of compassion and responsibility that had marked his treatment of her son's final moments. "Mrs. Garrett," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in respectful greeting. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Sorry, too, that it was my hand that took your boy from you." Sarah Garrett studied his weathered features for a long moment before speaking again, her words carrying a wisdom that came from understanding the harsh realities of frontier life. "You gave him more dignity in death than he showed in life, Marshall. The letter you sent, telling me his final words, giving him a proper name on his headstone instead of that awful moniker he chose. That was Christian kindness, and I'm grateful for it." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary, two people connected by violence finding common ground in their shared humanity. Sarah told Hayes about Billy's childhood, about the bright boy who had dreamed of becoming a teacher before making the choices that led him down a darker path. Hayes, in turn, shared what he could about Billy's final moments, offering what comfort was possible to a grieving mother. Before she left San Antonio to return to her small farm outside Houston, Sarah Garrett made a request that would change the trajectory of Hayes' remaining years. "I got another son, Marshall," she said quietly. "Tommy, he's just 19, and he's been running with a rough crowd since his brother took up with that gambling crowd. Would you consider talking to him? Maybe setting him on a better path than Billy chose?" 1 month later, Tommy Garrett arrived in San Antonio, carrying a letter from his mother and wearing the kind of defiant expression that marked young men who had been ordered to do something they didn't want to do. He was tall and lean like his brother, but his eyes held a spark of intelligence and decency that Billy's gaze had lost somewhere along his journey toward violence. The meeting between Hayes and Tommy took place in the same corner of the broken wheel where the legendary Marshall had first been underestimated by Billy Garrett. The irony was not lost on either man as they sat across from each other, separated by decades of experience and a shared connection to the young man who lay buried in San Antonio's cemetery. "Your brother died because he made poor choices," Hayes told Tommy with characteristic directness. "Not because he was evil, not because he was born bad, but because he chose the easy path instead of the right path. Now your mom has asked me to make sure you don't follow him down that same road." Tommy's initial response was predictably defensive, his words carrying the kind of bravado that young men use to mask their uncertainty. "Billy was twice the man you are, old-timer," he declared, though his voice lacked the conviction that such an insult required. "He told me all about you federal marshals, how you hide behind badges and kill folks who can't defend themselves." Hayes listened to the young man's anger without response, recognizing the grief and guilt that fueled such words. Tommy was mourning his brother while simultaneously trying to reject the reality of what Billy had become, a psychological conflict that could easily drive him toward the same violent path that had claimed Billy's life. "Your brother drew first," Hayes said quietly when Tommy's rant finally exhausted itself. "Had 3 men backing his play, held a gun to an old woman's head, threatened to kill her if I didn't back down. I gave him every chance to walk away, offered him mercy right up until the moment he chose violence over wisdom." The words hit Tommy like physical blows, forcing him to confront truths about his beloved older brother that he had tried desperately to ignore. But Hayes wasn't finished with his assessment of the situation that had led to Billy's death. "You want to blame me for your brother's choices. That's your right," Hayes continued, his pale eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "But blaming me won't bring Billy back, and it won't change the fact that you're standing at the same crossroads he faced. You can choose to learn from his mistakes, or you can follow him into an early grave. Either way, the choice is yours to make." The confrontation that followed was emotional rather than physical, 2 strong wills clashing over the memory of a dead man and the future of a living one. Tommy's grief poured out in angry words and bitter accusations, while Hayes absorbed the young man's pain with the patience of someone who understood that healing sometimes required the lancing of infected wounds. But gradually, as the days passed and Tommy remained in San Antonio rather than returning immediately to his mother's farm, a different kind of relationship began to develop between the legendary Marshall and the younger brother of his final victim. Tommy started asking questions about law enforcement, about the difference between justice and revenge, about the heavy responsibilities that came with wearing a badge. Hayes found himself sharing stories from his long career, tales that revealed both the nobility and the cost of frontier justice. He spoke of men he had been forced to kill, of families he had protected, of the thin line that separated civilization from chaos in the untamed territories of the American West. 6 months after Billy Garrett's death, Tommy stood before Judge Harrison Mitchell in the San Antonio courthouse, raising his right hand to take the oath that would make him a deputy sheriff under Dan Holloway's supervision. Hayes stood witness to the ceremony, his weathered features reflecting pride tempered by the knowledge of what such service would demand from the young man. The star that pinned to Tommy's vest was simple silver rather than the federal gold that Hayes had worn for so many years, but it carried the same weight of responsibility and the same promise of service to justice. Tommy's hands shook slightly as he took his oath, understanding that he was committing himself to a life that might require him to make the same kinds of impossible choices that had defined Samuel Hayes' legendary career. "Your job isn't to be fast," Hayes told Tommy during one of their training sessions behind the sheriff's office. "It's to be right. 44 men I killed over the course of my career, and every single one of those deaths weighs on my conscience like a stone. But every one of them was necessary. Every one of them prevented greater harm to innocent folks who deserve protection." The training continued through the autumn and into winter, Hayes passing on decades of hard-won knowledge about reading men's intentions, recognizing danger before it fully materialized, and making split-second decisions under pressure. But more importantly, he taught Tommy about the moral framework that had guided his own career, the internal compass that separated lawmen from gunmen. "Violence begets violence," Hayes explained as they practiced marksmanship in the hills outside San Antonio. "But sometimes violence is the only thing that stops violence. The trick is knowing when you've crossed that line, when killing becomes necessary to preserve life, when the badge gives you the authority to make that ultimate judgment." 1 year after the confrontation that had claimed Billy Garrett's life, Hayes found himself sitting in the same corner of the Broken Wheel Saloon, watching Tommy make his evening rounds as a deputy sheriff. The young man had grown into his badge with remarkable grace, showing both the courage to face danger and the wisdom to avoid it when possible. Martha served Hayes his customary whiskey, though she refused his money with the same stubborn determination she had shown for months. "How special for the gravedigger," she said with a smile that held genuine affection. "Man who saved my life doesn't pay for drinks in my establishment." Hayes accepted the gesture with quiet gratitude, understanding that Martha's kindness was her way of honoring not just his actions, but the memory of Elizabeth, who had always believed that good deeds should be recognized and rewarded by decent people. As the evening wound toward its close, Hayes walked the familiar path to San Antonio's cemetery, his boots striking the ground with the measured pace of a man approaching sacred ground. Elizabeth's headstone was simple but elegant, bearing her name and the dates that marked her journey through this world, along with the words "beloved wife" and "teacher" that captured the essence of who she had been in life. "Found a way to keep my promise to you, and still do right by that boy," Hayes said quietly as he knelt beside her grave. The words were spoken to the wind and the stars, but they carried the weight of a man's attempt to reconcile the demands of justice with the desire for peace. Maybe Billy's death meant something after all. If it could save his brother from the same path, Hayes continued, his weathered hands arranging the wildflowers he had brought from the hill country north of town. "Tommy's wearing a badge now, serving his community with honor. Got the makings of a fine lawman, better than his brother ever would have been." The conversation with his dead wife continued as it had every week for the past 8 years, Hayes sharing the events of his life with the woman who had shared his heart during their brief but meaningful marriage. He told her about Tommy's progress, about Martha's ongoing kindness, about the gradual healing that had followed the violence in the Broken Wheel. As he prepared to leave the cemetery and return to his small ranch north of the city, Hayes reflected on the strange patterns that seemed to govern human existence. Billy Garrett's death had been a tragedy, but it had also prevented greater tragedies by removing a dangerous man from the world and by steering his younger brother toward a better path. Justice, Hayes mused as he walked toward his waiting horse, was rarely as simple as the dime novels made it seem. Sometimes it required violence, sometimes mercy, sometimes the wisdom to know the difference between the two. But always it required good people to stand up when evil threatened the innocent, regardless of the personal cost such stands might demand. Tommy was waiting by Hayes' horse when the old marshal emerged from the cemetery, his deputy's badge catching the moonlight as he stood in respectful silence. The young man had taken to joining Hayes for these weekly visits, understanding that such rituals were important to men who carried heavy burdens. "Evening, Marshal," Tommy said quietly, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Peaceful night for riding back to the ranch." Hayes mounted his horse with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing years, but his pale eyes still held the alertness that had kept him alive through decades of frontier service. "Evening, Deputy," he replied, the title carrying genuine respect for the young man's commitment to justice. As they rode together through the Texas night, the legendary gravedigger, and the young lawman he had trained, Hayes reflected on the strange turns that life could take. He had come to San Antonio, seeking nothing more than a quiet drink and a moment's peace from the isolation of ranch life. Instead, he had been forced to add another name to his grim tally, while simultaneously discovering a purpose that his retirement had been missing. "Maybe there's hope for this old gravedigger yet," he said quietly as they reached the fork in the road that would take him north to his ranch and Tommy back toward town. "Always was, Marshall," Tommy replied with the quiet confidence of a young man who had found his calling. "Always was." The words followed Hayes into the darkness as he rode toward home, carrying with them the promise that justice would continue long after Samuel Hayes had hung up his guns for the final time. In training Tommy Garrett, in showing the young man a better path than the one his brother had chosen, Hayes had created something more lasting than his legendary reputation or his impressive tally of victories over evil. He had created hope, and in a world often governed by violence and despair, hope was perhaps the most precious legacy any man could leave behind. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and redemption, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of legendary lawmen who shaped the American frontier. These stories remind us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the violence we deliver, but from the violence we prevent through wisdom, mercy, and the courage to stand for what's right. Until next time, may your aim be true and your conscience clear.